great. Thank you all for coming, especially after a long day, being the end of the afternoon. So Julia and I are colleagues. We're at the University of New Mexico Prevention Research Center. And for those of you who didn't know your geography, that's New Mexico. And we're bordered on the south by Mexico, and then to the east by Texas, and a wee bit by Oklahoma, Colorado to the north, and Arizona to our west. And Utah at one little tiny point in the corner. For those of you who don't know a lot about our state, it is the 5th largest state by land mass in the country, but it only has about 2 million people in it. So population-wise, we have a lot of people living in rural communities. And actually, one of the larger green dot that's kind of the middle of the right-hand side, that's near Clovis and Portales. That area there, the service area for that rape crisis center in our community is about the size of New Jersey. So just to kind of give you perspective. Our population in our state is also kind of unique. We have over 10% of our population is Native American, and almost half of our population is Hispanic, where our African American and Asian populations are both under 3%. So just to give you, that's just a little bit of a backdrop of the community that we're looking at. And the context here is that about a year and a half ago, we, along with our Department of Health and our Coalition of Sexual Assault Programs in the state, got together to create a new strategic plan because ours had expired. And we were trying to figure out, well, what was going to go in that, who was going to be involved, and what were we going to do for it. And so one of the things we decided is that we wanted to look at having focus groups across the state, and that had been done with the previous strategic plan, specifically in our communities where we had rape crisis centers in 5 communities. But we're looking at it, they've been used in a lot of public health planning before and used by health departments before, and we really wanted to look at how can they be effectively used for us in strategic planning, and what can we add to the knowledge base for other people who would want to use a similar method for their own strategic plans. What we ended up deciding to do was to have this tiered approach. So we had 3 stages: an advisory group, bless you, a group of subject matter experts, and then a group that was our Rape Crisis Center staff that we worked with regularly, and then focus group participants that were invited in to those rape crisis centers and to some other sites that we'll tell you about in a little bit. So really the roles were distinct, that at the advisory group level, they're there to advise us and provide feedbacks, helping us develop the plan, taking into account what would go into our focus groups, as well as how to interpret what would come out of them, and to give very practical feedback on the drafts. We had subject matter experts that reviewed very specific sections of the draft, say about disability or the LGBT community. And we had recruitment and participation at the local level was assisted by our rape crisis centers. So just to give you a little bit of a view of who was on our advisory group, we worked with our coalition and with the Department of Health, who were really our leadership team going into developing the plan. And then we also had membership from the Indian Health Service, from the Women's Resource Center, which is on the University of New Mexico campus, the behavioral health services people, the LGBT community, disability advocates, and others who were interested in sexual violence prevention specifically and had expertise there. Our subject matter experts, we had people who dealt with sexual assault response, because again, we are talking about prevention, and that was our focus, but we wanted to make sure that we incorporated voices of people who were on the response side. We also have a data repository, and the woman who leads in that and does our data analysis for the state was on our committee and as part of our subject matter experts. We also had people who had expertise in PREA that were part of the team. And then again, LGBT and disability services. We had additional people who were subject matter expert reviewers. The participants themselves, where our advisory group came for monthly meetings, we met regularly with them for a year. The subject matter experts we kind of sent things off to, talked to on the phone, asked them to review things. The focus group participants really were there for a one-time 2-hour event in their communities. We involved the sexual assault prevention personnel and the Rape Crisis Center personnel from the centers across our state. We also asked them to invite in any community partners that they were working with, as well as priority population members. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that is. But for us and for you, when you're thinking about who you want to involve, if you want to do something similar in your own communities, and that's really what we want to talk about today. We're going to tell you how we did it, but also how hopefully you could use something similar as a model in your communities. We looked at populations that had high risks for sexual violence. We looked at some specific groups that we had an interest in and had heard from. We looked at our underserved populations with respect to programming, so who were we not getting to that we needed to? And then, were there other programs that were currently addressing something? Like, we already had a group that was addressing PREA. And so we were thinking, well, we don't need to duplicate what they're doing. So trying to take into account what other people were already working on. So some examples of priority populations that our advisory group and our constituency came up with were children, Native Americans, and addressing populations living in rural areas. All of these constituencies are in high numbers in our state, in our community, and all have higher risk for sexual assault. What we wanted to do next is to have, so when we were signing up for presentations, they said to please make your presentations interactive with activities, and then they gave us rooms that were set up like this, where last year we had round tables, so in our minds we had round tables. So we're going to do this a little bit differently than we had envisioned, but we'd like you all to be thinking about what the constituencies are in your communities, what the priority populations that you would have to work for, and then to let us hear from you on, we gave you a couple of ours here. And if you can think about some additional groups that would be priorities in your own communities. And community could be defined as your state, your service area, your city, your neighborhood, however you want to define community, but to just put some of those out there. All right. So we'll tell you then some of the other groups that we had. Julia's going to start with what our actual focus groups looked like and the priority populations that we ended up meeting with. Keeping in mind, we started out with the idea we were going to do 5, and we ended up with 11 of them.
Thanks, Teresa. Hi, everyone. So yeah, as Teresa said, I'm just going to tell you a little bit what we actually ended up doing. So more than twice as many as we originally envisioned. But the ones just kind of going down, we did a pilot with our advisory group, which was extremely helpful to kind of just test out the questions, which we discussed a lot going into the process, which I'll tell you about in a little bit. But just to practice and to have everyone in the advisory group actually experience being in a focus group was, I think, also really useful. And then the ones that are just labeled community, those are the original ones that we had planned with the communities where there's a rape crisis center. And then the ones in green are the priority populations that we ended up adding. So the male one, it wasn't intended to be with male victims. It was intended to gauge the willingness of college-age men to engage with the topic of sexual violence prevention. And so we had a special one at the University of New Mexico, and we had men from ROTC and athletics attend that focus group. We had a Native American focus group, and then some of the communities are rural in character or have large priority populations. So, for example, the next one down in Farmington, there's a lot of Native Americans there. So we hoped that people would talk also about Native Americans and the rural character of their community, and that ended up being the case. Then we ended up doing one in Las Cruces, which is along the border, where people talked about immigrant issues, but then we had one where we only invited Spanish-speaking immigrant folks also in that same community at a later date. And then we had an LGBTQ one, and then you can see there's several others, like Teresa said, most of the communities in our state are rural in character, so that came up over and over again. So why would you want to do focus groups? What is the purpose of doing a focus group? And they're really useful for gathering people's experiences, what's meaningful to them, what their opinions are, their priorities, and norms and cultural values that are particular to those communities. So you really get a unique sense of, you get a real sense of what is unique about these communities, but also in the ways in which they're similar to the other communities that you're talking to. But it helps you ascertain in a really short period of time priorities, challenges, and successes, and in one kind of fell swoop. But it also provides a range of opinions because you're getting a bunch of people in the room. They don't have to disagree, but often they have a range of opinions. And if you can create a respectful environment where people feel comfortable, you can actually, gather a range of opinions and actually foster really important dialogue. And so in that way, it could also be a starting point for collaboration. That wasn't really, one of our primary goals, but we hoped that getting a bunch of people in a room, especially with potential partners, people that people in sexual violence prevention work might want to work with, or were building relationships with, that it might spark ideas that they could then move forward with in the future. Okay, and so next, Teresa added this slide, which I love, of Albert Einstein saying, if I had an hour to solve a problem and my life depended on it, I would use the first 55 minutes determining the proper questions to ask. And this is key to me as a qualitative researcher, that you can't just go in and do a survey with people without knowing, are you asking the right questions? And so even in focus group guide development, we spent a great deal of time just developing the questions, testing them out with different people. We had a little mini group with just young folks in our office, just testing out the questions with them. We sent them to our advisory group and discussed them, 2 or 3 times, I think, with the advisory group. And that was very, it takes a lot of time, but it pays off, I would say, in the end. So some considerations for focus group guide development in terms of thinking about the questions as you move forward. So one of the things is we have 11 communities. You don't want the questions to be different for each community. If you're going to actually analyze your data and look across all the communities and see what they all have in common, as well as what's particular and different and special about each community, you need to be able to ask the same questions so that you can just have something to go across the board in terms of your analysis. So the key is to ask very open-ended questions. And do you all know what open-ended questions are? They're where you're not expecting a particular response. You're not asking a leading question. You're asking something, that has a multitude of possible responses to it. But you want the questions to be adaptable across all groups. And so this leads to better discussion. So one example is, this is an actual question from our guide. What do you think are some of the challenges in insert the priority population that need to be addressed when working to prevent sexual violence? So when we were working through this process, we, for example, with the LGBT community, people would say, well, you really need to ask about underreporting in this community. So we would have that in mind, but it would almost always come up in answer to these kinds of very broad questions. And if it doesn't, you just know that you need to follow up on that or ask a probe. And you also want to be thinking about what kinds of outcomes, what kinds of things you want to include in whatever your document is, in this case, the strategic plan. We knew we wanted our community's input on all the different aspects. So the vision that we were trying to articulate for the state, we wanted community voices about that vision. We wanted input on other indicators besides reporting levels, for example. We wanted information on barriers and what makes each community unique. So that's how we developed the questions. So the questions were really quite open-ended, quite straightforward, and they included things like, what are the strengths of your communities? What are the challenges of doing sexual violence prevention in your communities? And what partnerships would you like to develop? We also asked, what their vision was, like what would the world look like if sexual violence did not exist? Trying to get people to think about vision. Okay, So for the next exercise, what we'd like you all to do is think, so again, we're not going to divide up into groups, I think, because the room isn't set up the way we had envisioned. But what we'd like you to do is think about, based on these priority populations that people listed, or just ones that you may have in your own mind, maybe turn to someone near you and try to develop one or even more, if you have time, questions, focus group questions that you would include in a guide, kind of based on the guidelines that I already discussed. And you can have 5 minutes to do that, and then we'll ask you to report in on some of the questions, and we'll talk about each one. Okay, let's move on to talk a little bit more kind of along the lines of what Teresa was saying in terms of just how you go about putting together a focus group and just some of the things to keep in mind. So the way we did it, we worked with the rape crisis centers to help us recruit people, and we had a wonderful intern who spent a lot of time sort of interfacing with them, and it's a lot of time, right, to recruit people, to make sure everyone's kind of informed about logistics and all of that. But what we found was that you kind of lose control of the process a little bit, and that's okay when we ask them to basically recruit for us. And the aim is 8 to 12 participants, and so you always want to aim a little bit higher, right? And just to go back a little bit, the 8 to 12 participants really comes from the focus group literature, and if you just think about getting people in a room to talk about something, you want, a sizable enough number so that people don't feel completely called out, but you also don't want too many people. You want everyone to have a chance to really talk enough. But we asked people to slightly over-recruit, so we made sure we had our numbers, but then we weren't ever really sure exactly how many people were going to show up. So we had to be kind of flexible, but most of the time it worked out really well. If I went back to that initial slide that showed you how many people we had, I think the range was, now I can't remember, the 8 to 23, Teresa remembers. So 8's fine. 23 was a little bit much, but it actually ended up being fine, and I'll talk a little bit more about that particular case in a second. And so as Teresa said, you really need to think about your time. So if you only have 2 hours, really you can only ask about 10 questions, 10 to 12 questions, I would say. So it's not very many questions, and you have to really, again, thinking about focus guide development, really kind of pare down to what you really want to know. And you also need to leave a lot of time for consent at the beginning, just to make sure that people know what you're all about and understand the voluntary nature of the process and all of that. So what we did was we had so we planned out 2 hours for the focus groups, but then we asked people to come in half an hour early, and that actually worked extremely well. And during that time we had snacks. We didn't have a budget, unfortunately, to include money for specific incentives, but we felt like we really needed to offer people at least snacks and sustenance for their time, and sometimes we would even have breakfast if they were in the morning, but that tended to work really well to get people time to gather. Then we didn't really have stragglers coming in once we'd started. Everyone was consented before and fed, and actually all the focus groups, they were almost all exactly 2 hours on the dot, which I thought was interesting. I was kind of expecting more variation, but so challenges were, again, we weren't exactly sure how many people were going to show up. We had one focus group where we didn't have the participation that we wanted, and I think it was because it was intended to be a faith-based focus group in one of the communities, and I think what we kind of determined later was that the relationship with that, they were kind of hoping to use the focus group as a forum to kind of develop a relationship, deepen a relationship, and it turned out like none of those people came. So I think one of our lessons learned was really that, you have to kind of have a relationship with people prior to the focus group in order for it to be a comfortable space for people to talk about the topic. And the other one was the immigrant focus group that had 23 people, and that was just because there was so much interest in the community, and it was a very unique focus group. It was different from all of the other ones, and it was a very different focus group in that it was primarily community members, And there was just so much catharsis really that happened in that training. People were so grateful for the chance to talk about this issue, and there were actually a lot of disclosures of experiencing sexual violence within that focus group. And so you have to, and we had, from the very beginning, we realized that this might be the case, and we wanted people to feel safe and to have resources available. So we had local resources, contact information available at every focus group. So we'd kind of thought of that. We had thought of that initially, but it turned out to be very important at that group that we were prepared. Okay, so in terms of getting the conversation starting, thinking about creative ways to kind of get people engaged, one of the things, and to go back to your question too, because you'd asked about how kind of what the target was in terms of the kinds of people we were recruiting. So we kind of had three different targets, like people that were already working in sexual violence prevention, potential partners or people that they wanted to build partnerships with, and then just community members if they were interested in the topic. So everyone knew coming in that they were going to be talking about sexual violence prevention, for sure. So I think, there was already a certain comfort level there, right, just with the idea of it. But just getting people to, because we did have groups, some people that were community members that don't talk about this every day in their everyday work like you all do, we wanted to make sure that people were kind of on the same page in terms of just a level of awareness of the prevalence of sexual violence. So we actually started with a number of activities, and one of them was just showing them statistics, saying in the state of New Mexico, 1 in 4 women, have experienced some form of sexual violence. If it was a priority population and we had data points for that, we added those to that list. And then we just asked people to respond. And to those, like, what does this make you think? Or what do you think about this? And that was really, really interesting and really useful, I think, to start. The other thing we did was we gave them a definition of sexual violence, just to make sure that people knew what it was. It was the CDC definition of sexual violence, and people had very strong reactions to it, which was actually incredibly useful also in terms of just hearing. Kind of gives you a sense of where people are with the issue and the terminology that they use to talk about it. So that was also a great help. Okay. I think for me, coming in facilitating some of the focus groups and communities where, really I have I didn't know anyone really. In a way, it being that much of an outsider, I think what is a non-judgmental stance, and they don't know me. I have no foot in the game, except that I am completely, identifiable as a university researcher, which is a position in and of itself, which, has its drawbacks. But I'll say that, but then if you have priority populations and the facilitator is somebody from that community, I think it really helps, just to use the language, not linguistically, the terminology that people use, just the way of being in the world, I think is really, really important. So I think those are really important questions to consider when you're figuring out focus groups. But I will say, for example, for the male focus group, we did not plan for a woman to be in the room at all. And I felt kind of strongly about that. But then our facilitator got sick the day of the focus group. So we had to scramble around, and we found a wonderful guy in our office who had some, experience do the focus group. But we then had no one to be the note taker. So I was in the room as the note taker. And that was really interesting, for me to be in that room as a researcher. And they did sort of turn to me like, oh, you're the expert. And so they would ask me questions. And so I did end up engaging in that focus group a little bit. And I don't think, it impacted what they were willing to say. As I said, these were an amazing group of guys who were willing to step up. But I think you always have to think about those dynamics. And there's pros and cons to both. Yeah.
The other thing I would add to that is, for myself and for those of you who are intimately involved with the issue and with the community that you're working with, I felt like I did not want to lead the focus group because I'm too opinionated. And I would find myself being like, what do you mean? How could you think that way? And so I was like, for me, I know I needed to step back from it. And Julia's personality is much more willing to listen and hear everything that's coming without putting in those statements or appearing shocked at some of the things people would say. So I do think you just need to keep that in mind. If you are the one, though, I mean, in some of our situations, you're the one who's tasked with doing it and you have to do it, to keep in mind that you don't want to be putting your own feelings and opinions as the facilitator into the discussion. If it's a true focus group. If you're just having a group-led discussion, then, that's a different story. But if you're really trying to get their opinions without it being influenced by you, you need to make sure you just nod and smile and record things and don't interject your own opinions.
Yeah, that's such a good point, Teresa. And I will add that last bullet on there was when we used facilitators that were from the communities. They were all professional folks and had focus group experience, but we did make time to do a training with them just to reiterate those kinds of things, because they are opinionated. They do have opinions, but they did an excellent job of really taking on that facilitator role. And it was just, I think, a matter of just training and a reminder. Yeah, and so I think just in terms of focus group kind of theory and practice, one of the things is just making sure people have a chance that everyone talks right away is really helpful. If they talk right away, then they have a much more, they're much more likely to talk later on when you get into the dialogue phase. So one of the things you can do is just have everyone introduce themselves. We went around the room. We had people say where they were from, what community, organization they represented, or what community they represented, or communities, and just something fun. Like we said, what's something you like to do in whatever the season it was, fall, summer, spring. And then we also did round robin questions, a few where we asked people we asked, what is one word that you think of when you think about sexual violence? And we wrote that on the flip chart. And that was just also a good opportunity just to show, like, there's no right or wrong answers. You can throw anything out and it's all, interesting and important, and we're here to listen. Okay. So our plan for this third exercise was to conduct a little bit of a mock focus group, and that again was when we thought we were going to have tables. So unfortunately, I don't think we can do that, but I just thought I would lead you through a little bit some of the introduction that we did, kind of do an example of the round robin question so you can see what that kind of feels like, and then we'll pick one of the questions that you guys developed during the last exercise, and we'll just throw it out there to you guys so you can feel what it's like to sort of participate in a focus group. So during the introduction, what I would do is I would make sure that everyone was consented. I would introduce myself, and we had discussions about this with the advisory group, which was really interesting. And we decided, of course, that I had to disclose my affiliation with the university. I had to come out as a university researcher. But also I felt like it was important, that I state what my interest is in the topic and what my research has and how it relates to sexual violence. And all the facilitators ended up doing that. We just decided to err on that side, like one of our big, just because even though it may seem like a conflict of interest, potentially, we just wanted transparency in that, and that sort of like the idea that you lay out what your position is and that people then know where you're coming from, kind of thing. But very briefly. Then we did the introductions that I told you about. We went around and just made sure that everyone had a chance to introduce themselves and say something about themselves. And then we, let's see. Then we did the kind of activities that I told you about, those kind of introductory activities. I made sure that people understood about consent and confidentiality, which I've already kind of talked about a little bit. And then we set ground rules. Just the idea that only one person should talk at a time because, it's just respectful and polite, but also in terms of the recording, it's really hard if people are talking over each other. And then I talked a little bit about my role as a facilitator and, just letting people know that my role was to make sure that everyone had a chance to talk, that some people weren't talking too much, other people, weren't being, feeling safe to talk at all, so making sure people had the opportunity if they wanted to. But also, I told people that they didn't always have to respond to me, that the more it was like a conversation was better. And I think that was really helpful, that they weren't always, because I would notice that maybe some of the first focus groups, they were just directing every single comment to me. And then once I really emphasized that, then it became much more like a conversation and much more organic. And I think that was really a strength. Okay, so we can't do the introductions, but let's just throw out a popcorn question. And so I'd like to just ask you guys to pretend really briefly like you're in a focus group, and I'm going to ask, what is one word that comes to mind when you think about sexual violence prevention? Okay, so to kind of close out my section, and then Teresa's gonna move on and talk about a few other things before we end. So in terms of data analysis, one of the really quick, fun things that we realized we could do was with the round robin and the one-word responses, we created a word cloud. So the question we asked them was different than the one I asked you. It was, what is one word that you think about when you hear the term sexual violence? So you can see the words are much more negative, not as positive as what you guys came up with. But what we did, so this is across all 11 focus groups, and we just took each time that word was used, and so the more a word was used, the larger it appears in the word cloud. So that just gives you, I think it does give you a really nice visual, something that you can include in whatever, kind of report or product that you're producing at the end of your focus groups. And it's really easy to do. Okay.
All right, so being the one that she has to cut off more from talking too much, it just made me think of something that you can do if you're dealing with that issue, is also that redirection to just, as you're saying, oh, is there anybody we haven't heard from yet? Like as you're framing your question, or now let's hear from somebody who hasn't had a chance to speak about it. And sometimes that's enough to get the talkers that don't want to stop talking to give some space for some other people to be heard. So our next step, we were thinking, it's late in the day, we don't want to talk about data analysis too much, but we did put up some helpful hints about when you're thinking about data analysis. And actually the first one, I can't see your name from here, but Monty was talking about finding partners. And so you don't have to have all the skills yourself. You can look around and see if there's other people that could share their skills with you. And that might be somebody at a university like Julie and I. It could be somebody at your Department of Health that has those skills. So or volunteers in the community. So being open to looking around for those partners to help you. You also need to think about transcription needs. We did audio record all of the focus groups. We let people know, and that if they didn't feel comfortable with that, I think then they wouldn't sign the consent form to participate in it. And then also for the one that we did in Spanish, we had it translated so that when we were doing our word cloud and doing analysis across surveys, they would all be in the same language. You would need to think about computer software. How are you going to analyze the data? And we use a program called In Vivo, and there's Atlas TI and a couple others that are out there. If it's just one or two focus groups and you're just looking at in depth at those, then you probably don't need to get software. If you're going to have a handful or more of them, then it's probably helpful to do that. And then time. It does just take a while to code the different surveys. Focus groups, and we had 11 of them, and they were each 2 hours, so it did take time to go through those and code. And then we also made sure take the feedback that we got from them and not only incorporate it into the report, but take it back to our advisory group. So this is what we're hearing out of our focus groups. What do you think about this? Getting their input. And when we had people sign in for the focus groups, we asked them to let us know if they wanted a copy of the report when we were done so that we could send that out to them. So making sure that you're keeping that community included throughout the process. Some of the results from ours, one thing that we really noticed from 6 years ago, the last time it was done, to now, is the big change in the willingness and the understanding of sexual violence as a public health problem, that people were bringing it up themselves, and most all of the focus groups were talking about how this affects people's health. And so that was nice to see. We also... Julia talked a little bit before about this idea of that people felt like you couldn't just have a strategic plan on primary prevention. You needed to talk about the comprehensiveness. You needed to talk about inclusion of response and treatment and where that fits in the whole big picture, that these things should be working together. They also talked about a little bit of what's come out here too is you can have a strategy that works, but the actual application may look different in your different communities. It may need to be adapted if you're going to have something in a rural community or with a faith-based community in your area. So thinking about, yes, you need something that's going to be, that's something that has a hope of working, and or you should be evaluating things to make sure that they work, but also this understanding that things need to be adapted for the specific communities that you're working in. There was also this huge desire for a common language. People wanted to know how they should talk about sexual violence in their communities. And so we're fortunate, hopefully this is going to work well because we're just embarking on this process of having a communications person who's worked on social justice issues before is going to be hired by our state in New Mexico to work on a communications plan together with our rape crisis centers. And then they also really wanted to know, so what works here? You know, we've heard what works in other places, what works here. And so, as many of you, we're all struggling. If something was done in Atlanta or Iowa or Boston, how are we going to see and evaluate how it works in New Mexico? Or if there are homegrown programs there, we have plans to evaluate those during this coming year, to look at those, to give that information back to them. So we are incorporating the data we got from the focus groups as well as from the advisory group and the expert panel. We've put it together, that information, into the plan. We are also trying to include fact sheets, one page front and back, on each of our priority population groups that we wanted to address. And then we have the vision, mission, goals in the strategic plan are all things that are based in the responses we got from the focus group. Because it doesn't do any good to do all the focus groups and then ignore what they say, right? You need to make sure that you're incorporating that into the report or research or whatever programming that you're doing. Some of the lessons learned, Julia already talked about the design, and I mentioned early on, we were going to do 5 focus groups. That was our plan, that's what we had funding to do. And we did 11 focus groups, and we ended up doing them all over the state and with populations that we hadn't initially planned to do them. So really being able to not just being flexible in the numbers, but also, you know, you're doing focus groups when the people can make it. So one of them was 5 to 7 at night. We worked to make sure that we weren't going to be at the same time as the athletes having to do their practice when we had the one at UNM. So really being considerate of the time of the people who are participating and making sure that you can be flexible enough to work with them. And having somebody get sick on you on the last day, and making sure you had a backup plan for those kind of things. And then somebody mentioned earlier, was that you, having faith-based groups? So we tried to do that, and Julia mentioned none of them came to that one. And so we're talking about that you might need to have more groundwork done before some people are invited to participate, before they'll feel comfortable. And then time. That was, when we expanded from 5 to 11, and we added one in Spanish, in a Spanish language, and we had to have training for the Native American. We had different facilitators for the LGBT group, for the Native American group, for the Spanish group. So then we had to bring in time for training those people, and for setting up the additional focus groups. So just keeping those things in mind, that your time may expand or need to expand. But it didn't. That's the thing. We had 1 year to do it, right? So I was like, we're trying to cram everything in. Data collection, Julia mentioned disclosures and making sure that you have that backup plan for how to get people's needs taken care of. And actually, on the positive side, so somebody was concerned about consent. We did the consent forms with people. And, when you're filling out the IRB, Institutional Review Board stuff, they say, what are the harms that are going to come to people if they're doing your research? And so we were concerned, like, this could bring up some bad experiences to people and have them relive it, and that we didn't want to hurt people. And so we talked about that. But what we found in the immigrant one was almost the opposite, where people said somebody finally cares to ask us how we feel and what happens. And so that was really nice for us to have that kind of opposite reaction to what we were doing. So in dealing with like the big picture, so this is not representative of your community. It's not like you did a random sample of all the people and did a survey of them, that kind of thing. So it's not something that you can use to say that you know how everybody in your state feels. What you do try to do, though, is go to enough people to where you're hearing the same things over and over again, and they call that saturation, where you kind of reach to a peak of having that you're hearing the same responses from the majority of the focus groups. Now that did happen for a lot of our responses, but there were some unique things that came out because there were unique focus groups as well. So, would it have been great had we been able to do 10 Native American focus groups, or 26, since we have 26 tribes in New Mexico? That would have been great. But you also have to be practical. So trying to do it do as much as you can to where you're hearing the same responses gives you more of a feeling like you're kind of hitting the key points that you need. And then data analysis, we talked about the giving feedback, and then just this idea that, we went in thinking about what some of the challenges would be, funding, for example, but having your ears open to hear those emergent things that are just coming from the group, that aren't things that you thought about ahead of time, but come out through the discussions. And of course, we didn't do it alone. We had the coalition was our partner, the Department of Health. We had our advisory group. We had all of our rape crisis centers participated, and of course the participants that were there. And then Leona admitted her affiliation with us, and then Sam Baer, who was a great graduate student with us. And then we had somebody. Renee Robillard, who helped us with editing our document to make sure, how sometimes you get like so into it, and it's a large document, and we will, if you are interested in seeing it when it's done, our strategic plan, we finished it and turned it in the end of June. It's with our Department of Health now to review, design, and print, and we would be happy to share it, and we'll have it online for us when we get it done as well. And then for the online slides, we also put some resources for those of you who are interested in like following up and getting more information on how to do qualitative research, and In Vivo was the program that we use. Great. Thank you all so much for coming.